Somewhere in ancient Greece, there was a nation that made stealing part of the school curriculum. Not against the law. Encouraged. Rewarded. In Sparta, if you stole and got away with it, you were praised. If you got caught, you were beaten half to death. The crime was never the theft. The crime was being clumsy enough to get caught. In Athens, just a short distance away, boys studied rhetoric, music, and philosophy. In Sparta, the curriculum looked nothing like that at all. This wasn't a loophole. It wasn't corruption. It was policy, deliberate, official, written into how an entire generation of boys was raised. At age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families. Not sent to school, not sent to work. Enrolled into a state-run training system called the Agoge, built around one single goal: turn children into soldiers who could survive absolutely anything. They were given almost nothing. One thin cloak, regardless of the season. No shoes, ever, to harden their feet against rocky ground. They slept on beds they wove themselves, out of reeds pulled from a riverbank by hand. No knives allowed, because that made the task harder. And harder was the entire philosophy. And food, deliberately, not enough to live comfortably on. Historians believe the hunger was the entire point. A well-fed boy waits patiently for his next meal. A hungry boy goes looking for one. And that is exactly what the Spartan state wanted its future soldiers to do. So the boys stole. From gardens. From kitchens. From the communal dining halls where grown Spartan soldiers ate their meals. And officially, this was allowed. Encouraged, even. The boys weren't raised individually, either. They were organized into small units called herds, age-lie, each one competing constantly against the others. Whoever led a herd was chosen not by age, but by cunning and toughness, decided by the boys themselves. Losing your herd's rivalry could mean real consequences: less food, harsher tasks, public humiliation in front of the community. Winning meant more freedom, more respect, and eventually a shot at real leadership within Spartan society. But there was one rule that changed everything. If you were caught stealing, you weren't punished for the theft. You were punished for failing, for being seen, for lacking the skill to pull it off cleanly. Sparta's economy depended entirely on helots, a subjugated population who outnumbered actual Spartan citizens by a huge margin, and who did all the physical labor citizens were forbidden from doing. Maintaining control over that many people, with so few citizens, meant Spartan society treated discipline, obedience, and secrecy as matters of survival, not just tradition. Ancient writers like Xenophon described this as training in stealth and cunning, skills a real soldier would desperately need on an actual battlefield, where slipping silently past an enemy line could be the difference between living and dying the next morning. The most famous story tied to this practice comes from the historian Plutarch. He describes a Spartan boy who managed to steal a live fox. Wanting to avoid being caught holding it, he hid the animal under his cloak. But the fox didn't stay still. As the story goes, the boy stood in front of an instructor, giving no outward sign of what was happening beneath his clothes, rather than reveal the theft and be humiliated in front of his peers. Plutarch claims the boy ultimately died, rather than confess. Whether that particular story is literally true is something modern historians still debate. Earlier writers like Herodotus and Thucydides, closer to Sparta's own lifetime, focused mostly on the army's discipline and its battlefield reputation. It was later Roman-era writers, centuries afterward, who added many of the more extreme, almost mythical details we still repeat today. Many ancient accounts of Sparta actually came from outsiders, often from rival city-states like Athens, who had every reason to exaggerate just how extreme and how alien Spartan customs really were. Some scholars now call this pattern the Spartan mirage, a legend built up over centuries, part fact, part myth, polished by writers who never actually lived there. Still, even the skeptics tend to agree on the underlying practice. Theft, as a skill, was tolerated. Getting caught wasn't. Theft wasn't the only test Spartan boys endured. At a shrine to the goddess Artemis Orthia, boys took part in an annual endurance ritual, a public whipping contest where the goal wasn't to avoid the pain, but to endure it without making a sound. Ancient sources claim some boys collapsed. A few, reportedly, never got back up. The lesson was always the same. Pain wasn't the enemy. Weakness in front of others was. This single rule tells you almost everything about what Spartan society actually valued. Not honesty, in any conventional sense. Not fairness. Competence. Results. The ability to execute, under pressure, without ever getting caught. A soldier who could forage quietly, adapt under stress, and avoid detection, was worth more to Sparta than a soldier who simply followed the rules and went hungry. Because on a real military campaign, Hesitation and weakness got you killed. Skill and cunning kept you alive. It's a strange kind of ethics, if you can even call it that. Right and wrong weren't measured by the act itself. They were measured by whether you got away with it. It's uncomfortable, because most of us like to believe morality is one consistent standard. Sparta built an entire civilization on proving that isn't always true. And if you think that mindset died with ancient Sparta, look a little closer at the world around you. Competitive workplaces that quietly reward whoever closes the deal, regardless of how. Political scandals that end careers not because of what was done, but because it was caught on camera. Academic and corporate cultures where quietly bending the rules is normal, and only getting exposed turns it into a crisis. Sports scandals where the real unwritten rule always seems to be don't get caught, not don't cheat. Entire systems, even today, that punish exposure far more harshly than they punish the original offense. Kids in high-pressure sports academies, elite academic tracks, even certain family businesses, often learn a quieter version of the exact same lesson. Mistakes are tolerated. Exposure is not. By the time these boys reached their early 20s, they'd spent over a decade being tested, not on what they knew, but on how well they could perform under scrutiny. Passing wasn't marked by an exam. It was marked by whether you were still standing and whether you'd never been caught lacking. Modern psychologists studying elite training programs still recognize this pattern. Stress inoculation, controlled hardship, deliberately withholding resources to force adaptability. Sparta appears to have stumbled onto some of these principles more than 2,000 years before psychology existed as a field. Sparta didn't invent that instinct, but it might be the earliest civilization in history to write it down as law and hand it to 7-year-old children as their very first lesson in how the world actually works. Maybe that's the real reason this story still gets told 2,500 years later. Not because of the fox, because it forces you to ask an uncomfortable question. How many of the rules you live by are really about right and wrong? And how many of them are just about not getting caught? So next time a scandal breaks not because someone lied, but because someone got caught lying. Remember, that instinct has a much older, much colder history than you might think.